Our first session is learning inequalities and social mobility. And we're going to have 4 papers looking at different dimensions of inequalities. Inequalities between genders, social mobility across generations, and inequality between classes defined by wealth, more in the present tense. So I'll take them kind of in reverse order. My colleague Dave Evans here at the center is going to talk about gender. And we had this room packed. Some of you were here a couple of nights ago. With experts talking about the frustratingly slow progress in translating increased schooling for girls into real gender equality for adults. But Dave was going to talk to us about a review of evidence about how to get the 130 million girls who aren't in school into school and how to improve their learning outcomes, with some perhaps surprising, perhaps heretical results about the relative effectiveness of girl-targeted interventions versus more general efforts to improve access and learning. So turning from gender to kind of social mobility across generations, we have 2 papers with data that enables them to go kind of way, way back, really long-term effects. The first, well, at least a little ways back, at least before I was born, to the early 1970s, Marieke Kleemans is going to revisit one of the most famous natural experiments in development economics, which is Indonesia's 1970s school construction boom. And Marieke and co-authors are going to extend earlier results from Esther Duflo, showing that not only did school construction boost educational attainment and the adult earnings of those kids who were exposed to that, but they can extend this now to look at those impacts across multiple generations, with particular emphasis on what happens to girls and transmission through their mothers. Now, going further back in the Wayback Machine, Leonard Wantchekon is going to be here to talk to us, take us all the way back to late 19th century Benin. And he's going to look at the expansion of mission schools, where kind of his previous work has shown these dramatic effects on income mobility that we can trace across 3 generations. And in his new work, he's going to look at those impacts not just for the direct beneficiaries, but how those effects spilled over to changing social norms and preferences around schooling across generations. Now, finally, those have been all papers on a fairly optimistic theme. We've talked mostly about the benefits, the huge benefits across generations of schooling, which is in a little bit of tension with Rye's emphasis on improving learning for kids who are in school. So in our first paper that's going to kick off, Abhijeet Singh is going to talk to us about learning outcomes, and in particular the prospect of improving primary school learning outcomes to redress the huge inequalities we see between wealth groups and classes in educational attainment. And he's going to exploit kind of the few data sets we have that track kids and observe their learning early on in life and see where they end up, to see whether improving learning early on in life can redress those inequalities we see between wealth classes. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Abhijeet. We've got 15 minutes each. We're going to run straight through the 4 papers, and then everybody's going to come up here for a Q&A from all of you once they conclude. Over to you, Abhijeet.
Right, so thanks a lot for having me, and I think the reason for putting me first up is that you may as well have, well, less positive news early, and then everything is like a step upwards from here, right? But this is going to be a really simple paper. What we're trying to do is essentially put together descriptives about, well, how much do we think improving learning outcomes can actually do anything to change welfare outcomes for individuals going forward. This is joint work with Jishnu and Andre C. Chang, who's also somewhere in the there, both at the World Bank. And think of this as essentially a framing kind of presentation. The facts that frame this are that schooling levels have gone up really rapidly, basically everywhere in the world, right? At the same time, we know that learning outcomes are pretty poor, and that's been kind of the learning crisis that motivates a lot of current educational research, policy, programming, this conference. And what we want to do is take a bit of a step back and say, well, why do we care about learning outcomes? Well, one important reason is that we think that, it's not just the years of schooling. What you know is what helps you later to go on, get to higher education, get to better jobs, earn more, and get better payoffs in the labor market. The problem is essentially we don't really have too many data sets that track individuals over a sufficient period of time where you observe two things. How much did they actually know at the end of primary school, and what did their outcomes as adults look like? Now, this is information that is incredibly standard in a range of OECD countries, and we've taken quite a lot of that. Knowledge is given from the US and Europe, and we want to see, well, do relationships kind of look like that in this context? Specifically, 3 questions. One is just how large are SAS inequalities in the amount of schooling you've completed by your early 20s. So specifically, I'll be talking about, well, how much schooling do you have by the time you're 22? You'll see why. And that has to do with these really large expansions in schooling. Like, how large are these gaps today as opposed to a while ago? But most of the paper is going to focus on the second bit, which is how much of the eventual inequalities we see in how much schooling individuals got can be explained in a statistical sense with differences in their cognitive achievement when they were about 12 years old, right? So, I mean, you're typically talking about grade 6 or so. I mean, it depends across country. And to the extent that differences in how much you knew, conditional on being in school, explain what your eventual learning outcome, what your eventual schooling outcomes are in early adulthood. Well, we want to see, well, how do test score inequalities evolve over the course of childhood, right? So, I mean, this is a lot like the literature around, well, what's the optimal time to invest in closing various socioeconomic gaps in test scores. And these are 3 basic descriptive questions that we would argue we don't have tons on. Just some context from rich countries. I mean, if you look at, say, somewhere like the US, this is college attendance in the NLSY. Well, from the top, you can basically see that students from much more privileged socioeconomic backgrounds, essentially, over all the cohorts that you see, attend college at much higher rates. Where we're coming from is a different pattern in the data, which is that this is in the NLSY 79, that if you classify students by the terciles on test scores, and these are test scores at 14. So think of this as this is before dropout has started. This is at the end of compulsory schooling. And these are for income quartiles. Well, if you had good test scores, you basically don't see an SES gradient, right? And this seems to be less true in recent cohorts, but this is kind of the motivating fact that forces all of the thinking around, well, we really need to get test scores right early enough in school, right? So if you get test scores right, there doesn't seem to be an SES gradient, and within test score terciles, it's perhaps there's a little bit in the middle, but substantially less than you would see in the aggregate stats. In low and middle income countries, we just haven't been able to examine this, right? I mean, there's clearly going to be differences across countries, and there's clearly going to be differences at different points in time, including, say, somewhere in the US. What do we know? Well, amongst things that we know but are underappreciated is that even in developing countries, if you just look at sort of returns to education, so just OLS, MINSER returns, nearly all of those are much higher now at tertiary than they are at earlier levels, right? So this is from the World Bank. It's looked at something like 200 odd surveys, so you can also look at trends of this. But essentially, the story there is that really, much like the US, it seems as if the big labor gains are about finishing secondary and hitting tertiary, and that's true essentially in all regions of the world. Okay. Where does that leave us? Well, the US-like story could be true, right? So you could have a path that goes from low learning in primary school years, earlier dropout, lower eventual schooling, and that means you never hit the higher levels where wage returns kick in. So that's exactly the kind of cycle towards the persistence of socioeconomic inequality that we might think should be worried about. We just don't know whether that channel pans out in quite the same way. And the reason is that we just have very few panels that have test scores early enough and eventual schooling outcomes 10, 12 15 years later, right? And to the extent that we have trials that have raised test scores, there just hasn't been enough time to see what eventual outcomes of these people will be, right? So stuff could look like the US, but it could look different. What do? We basically assemble longitudinal data from 5 countries where it is possible to have test scores early enough, so about 12 or grade 6, and we have completed schooling at about 22, 23 years of age, so it differs a little. And we look at 5 data sets. So the LEAPS study in Pakistan, in rural Punjab, that many of you would be familiar with, and the Young Lives studies in Ethiopia, 2 states in India, Peru, and Vietnam. And what is nice in these is that you have good continuous measures of test scores. You don't sample conditional on enrollment. You see outcomes 10, 12 years later. And the tests are designed and administered independently. So also because we don't quite trust admin data on test scores in many of these countries. What's also nice is that these 5 countries, for reasons not of design, end up spanning a lot of variation across low and middle income countries, both in sort of geographically, but also in terms of student learning and inequality. What do? We define socioeconomic status in terms of a composite which is around household assets and parental education. And all I want to do is just show you differences across terciles of this SES. How different do outcomes for students from the bottom tercile and students from the top tercile look, and how much of that goes away if you condition for test scores, right? So I mean, that's the simple statistical exercise here. And let me just quickly preview the results, and then I'll do a relatively quick run through. Years of schooling are high. Okay, so everywhere schooling's increased dramatically. So in these 5 countries, for kids in the bottom third, they're all going to school for 8 to 11 years, depending what country, right? So this is much higher than in their parents' generation. Yeah, so students from the top tercile have about 3 years more. The kicker is that these are these 3 years that come at exactly the spot at which you would start to expect wage returns. Okay, so even though we've increased it to just the point before you would start to expect wage returns to actually kick in these samples. The contribution of test scores to SES gaps, well, the good news is that so the good news is that if you condition on test scores, that better test scores at 12 are massively predictive of how many years of school you will complete, even conditional on parental wealth, parental education, and where you live, right? But the magnitude of this link is relatively small. So like if you got 1 standard deviation higher test scores, you get about 1 year to 2 years more of schooling at the age of 22. And at any level of achievement, higher SES students get more schooling, right? So the pattern that we were looking at, which is that if you got high enough test scores, there's no SES gradient, that just doesn't seem to be true in any of the 5 countries that we look at, okay? And I'll quantify some of this later. In terms of the evolution of test score gaps, it actually seems pretty constant. These were big at the earliest time we see them, and they're roughly as big at later, like at about 15, okay? Sample characteristics, kids in the bottom and top terciles come from different families, okay? That's not the relevant part, but I guess the one thing that I would want you to know is that if you just look at, well, what is the difference between the education of the most educated parent, you're typically talking between 7, 8, 9 years of education, right? So I mean, these are students in the top tercile are coming from very different households and very different characteristics. When you look at just differences in completed schooling, kids in the bottom tercile are all getting about 8, 9, possibly 11 years in Peru, which is the end of secondary schooling. Kids at the in the top tercile are always getting about 2.5 to 3.5 years more. And a lot of that is about who gets to go on to tertiary education, which, as I've tried saying earlier, kind of we think would matter. So now I'm just going to run you through a set of pictures which are trying to impose very little structure. On the x-axis is just your test score at the age of 12. On the, that's probably not what I should be doing. On the y-axis, just the years of completed schooling at 22. And the way to think about this is that if you're at the mean, well, this is how much a kid from the bottom third would get, this is how much a kid from the top third would get, and that would be the SES gap, right? There's two things that I want you to take away from the whole set of this picture. Each of these dots is a decile of achievement for that group. In Ethiopia, you see quite a lot of overlap for most of the distribution, right? So it's not a situation where rich kids and poor kids basically have very, very different levels of achievement starting out, right? So there's lots of poor kids and rich kids who have achievement in effectively this range. In India, essentially at all levels of achievement, you see everything just shifted up. So conditional on achievement, there are these large gaps, but again, there's quite a lot of overlap even at the top end. Although in India, there's like this bottom end where there's almost no kids from rich households who know quite that little. Pakistan, again, has lots of overlap. The one case that I want to focus on is Peru, because this is really quite different. Here, there's almost no overlap in test scores, right? So these 6 deciles at the top end amongst rich kids have almost no similar kids from poor households. And what these do is that they imply very, very different things about what you would do to get people ready for college, get people ready for finishing higher secondary school. And these are things that we haven't quite been able to look at previously. Okay? And even in Vietnam, which is on many metrics a much more equal country, you see quite a lot of differentiation, both in SES gaps, in test scores, and whether at similar levels of achievement students get to go on to higher education, because that's really where differences are coming in. This, I just want you, so I mean, you can put this in a basic linear specification, and all I want you to take away here is that a standard deviation higher in test scores basically gives you between 1 and 1.6 years more of education, right? So 1 standard deviation is a massive increase in how much we would be able to change test scores. There's nothing at scale that we've ever managed to do that's been about half the size, okay? The gains, we're not talking about them, at least in the OLS, being pretty high. And if you put this in like a standard decomposition, well, what would happen if I did a counterfactual, if I did a thought exercise of, let's just close all the test score gaps, let's just close all the gaps in household status and so on. Well, closing the test score gaps closes between half a year of difference, so about 20% of the gap between the rich and kids from rich and poor households in Pakistan, to about slightly more than half in Ethiopia. In a bunch of countries, what you actually get from closing differences in just household socioeconomic status are just much higher, right? So to the extent that we have, to the extent that we've completely like borrowed this business about if we were to close test score gaps, if we were to make sure everyone received education of similar quality, they would have similar life outcomes, it seems like we would go some way in closing these gaps, but that's actually much smaller than things like credit constraints, et cetera, might be. Okay. In primary years, it essentially looks like gaps stay roughly the same magnitude, right? So from the ages of 8 to 15, we don't really see much of an increase anywhere except Pakistan. Okay. What should you take away? So this is the last slide. Well, test scores correlate with later schooling, and that, well, thank God, because otherwise, really, what have we all been up to? And building foundational skills in primary school, I mean, it seems like it's worth doing, but to the extent that we think that all of social mobility can be tackled by closing test scores, these are somewhat depressing results, right? So the magnitude of this is small, like a standard deviation increase, which I would be thrilled if I achieved in any project. That would kind of increase the years of schooling by 1 or 2 years. And to the extent that we worry about omitted variables and so on, we think that these would be upwards bias. Equating test scores helps reduce these gaps, but typically only 50% or less. Yeah. So certainly things about, well, what importance should we give to things like credit constraints versus the lack of academic preparation? Well, those answers look like they would look very different for these countries than they look in a lot of the work that came out of, well, especially the US, but also Scandinavian as well, right? So that's it. Was that coherent?
Right, ready? Okay, so my name is Leonard Wantchekon from Princeton and also the African School of Economics. So this is a follow-up paper to one that I presented 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, here. And the first paper came out in QJE, and this one is an extension that covers 3 generations as opposed to just 2, and also focus on mechanism of social mobility. If I can have a slide. Is it coming? Okay. So another thing which is very interesting about this paper is that I managed to turn my autobiography into a paper. You know, so it's uncommon, but let's get started. So social mobility, as we all know, is a relationship between parents' social economic status and that of their parents. It depends on abilities, depends on background, family background, and social environment. I think it should be, if it's not already, a very crucial element to assess social progress and measure development. So it's a very active research area, you know, especially recently with the work of, several colleagues from Harvard, Chetty, Alessina, and so on. But that literature overall tend to be descriptive and focus on estimating correlations and elasticity between parents and children income. And there is little known about micro foundation. You need to see the faces. We need to see, individuals who are, that we are trying to, for which we are trying to capture the level of mobility. We also lack causality and underlying mechanism. There is a theory work that's from Benabou and Piketty, focusing on whether mobility is driven by effort or by luck meaning income. But this has not been tested empirically. So another thing which is also very important is the lack of attention to social networks, like to see to what extent success and mobility of one transmit to others, so which is an important element. So, okay, it's a long paper, but let me just tell you about what the focus is. The focus is methodology. First, I think it's one of the first paper to use historical applied micro approach to social mobility as opposed to big data approach used by Cherry and others. It also exploits data from a natural experiment with spillovers. And what is also very important is we uncover the underlying behavioral mechanism of social mobility, and then exploit the way social mobility across generation affects risk preference and attitudes, which in the end affect social economic outcome. Okay, so I think you may have seen this already. So my inspiration for this is a story from where I was born, my village, where it appears that the local school, a mission school that was set up in 1895 was near random. So this guy, one from Indiana, one from France, they travel, they get lost, they were saved, and then they were asked by Vatican to go back and visit the roots, and they set up a school, and school was in session, and then it get personal because this is one of these guys who was picked up, near randomly by one of the missionaries, and that's him 55 years later, and he is the brother of my dad and my mother, and then the uncle of this guy who was raised to be the reincarnation of René. So that's him when he was 10, 14, looking a bit more like René. Much later, 5 years ago, when it appeared that he did slightly more than René. So that's the place I came back. It's a place with incredible level of academic success. 350 people in the 60s produced 13 PhDs. So, it appears to me that this is a natural experiment, and I decided to expand to look at places like my village. With the criteria being they have to be far away from the coast, they should have no prior European settlements. So I selected a bunch of them. But then once I selected the location, I need to look at valid counterfactual. So places where the school could have been created, but was not created. So what I did, typically, I draw 7 kilometers around this place, and 20 kilometers around, between 7 and 20, there are a bunch of villages. I randomly select 2 of them. So those villages end up being my control. So, and then for individual treatment, what I did was I basically focused on the first 2 cohorts. And what's more interesting is to check those who could have gone to school but did not. What I did was I did something called backward sampling, where I selected 40 people from the place and asked them about their grandparents and double check when your grandparent is from the age of those guys who went to school, then he's part of my sample. If he's not, he's removed. So as a result, I have 3 groups. I have groups of control, far away from the school, no one go to school. The village, we have people who actually been to school and people who did not go to school but lived near, near those who went to school. So what is interesting is that by looking at the mobility of those who live near, so those who have some kind of aspiration shock, I can disentangle the effect of being lucky, meaning go to school, and be unlucky at the beginning, but close enough to those who have been lucky so that you can benefit from some kind of aspiration shock. So to see how networks are important, assume that the school is created at M, and then only villagers from, there is only G and N has people who have been to the school. Assume that those who have been to school, for instance, the social network structure looked like this, in N, and like that in G. You can see that, here you have 2 directly treated, green, and only 2 indirectly treated. Over there, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it shows how the nature of the networks, the way the individual who is placed, who is educated, is placed in the village has a big effect. And then what is interesting in the data is that HI and all the places, no one there have been to school, they look like the control. So basically, I get the name of all these guys. Yeah, I said one of them, this guy was still alive, when he came from out of the school that was set up much later in 1922, and and so on. So I already talked to you about the data collection, the interview, balance. Shows that it's that the design looks like a natural experiment. And okay, now let's go to social mobility. So we have 4 key results. So first of all, here is the transition matrix from the first to second generation. You can see that let's say when you don't go to school, you have 51% chance of your kids not going to school, and so on. Wealth, so basically wealth, I use assets, like housing quality, means of transportation, and other, type of asset to measure wealth. And so this is from the second to the third. You can see, for instance, that when you are in control, your level of mobility is still very low. You can see if you don't go to school, you have 71% of chance that your kids stay. And but now, what is interesting is let me get you straight to since I'm okay. This is the key table. So this is wealth transition. So I divided this into 3 categories: the individually treated, those who have been to school, their mobility; the indirectly treated, treatment village, those are the transition metrics, and the control. What you can see here is that, for instance, okay, if you are lower class and your dad is educated, you are second generation, you have 28% of chance that your grandkid will still be lower class. But if you are untreated, it's down to 11%. So, and you can see that the upper class places very well their upper class kids, 85% of chances, and it's only 71% for the indirectly treated, but you can see overall the level of mobility is higher on the village treated than individually treated. And what is interesting in particular is the fact that their ability to get their grandkids out of poverty is higher when your grandfather was aspiration driven as opposed to be lucky to be picked to go to school. So the view that, like economic status, it only maintained through income is not necessarily true. It can be maintained through aspiration shock, because how lucky these guys were with the fact that their dad were living near a school, did not go to school, and the drive for success is something that they pass on to generation to generation. So the control is still very, very, very different and low, but what is interesting here, you can see the overall mobility in the country being reflected by what's happening in control. So I compare this result to like mobility in the US, in Sweden, and Mexico, and the result indicates that in fact, the level of mobility in Benin is similar to that of Mexico, And then if you focus on this group, it's out of the chart. It could be compared to mobility in advanced, capitalist countries, So it shows that when you are looking at mobility, it's important to look at average, the typical, which is the control, but also to look at those groups separately, especially interestingly this group, because they are the one who, anyway. So I use different methodology, I use marginal effect and so on, but let me tell you two other stories. One is, how does mobility decrease inequality? So what I find is that education, like the treated places, the level of inequality decrease over time. And more so with village treated than the individually treated. So it shows that aspiration not only helps mobility, it's inequality reducing. Not only inequality between families, but also within families. So for instance, I have this to show how freedom and control inequality evolve over time. You can see it's very high, control and treatment, and then it decreases over time. So the link between mobility and inequality is something that also hold here in the micro data. So another thing that we did is the behavioral mechanism of social mobility. So what I did was to see how social mobility itself affect the risk preference, time preference, and also risk and also life outlook. So because those third generation guys are still alive. So we survey them. We play behavioral game with them. We actually interview them. So we find that not only income predict risk attitude, but the fact that your parents is moving, the mobility itself, like the fact that you are moving up from your grandparents and from your parents has effect on your risk attitude. So we find, for instance, here is the table, social mobility is positively related to self-reliance, work ethics, and life outlook. So social mobility itself has behavioral effect. So, so basically, before I conclude, I'll just tell you basically what we did is to use historical applied micro approach to social mobility and find that there is mobility from first to second, from second to third, and we find that education reduces inequality, and we find that, for instance, those who were lucky enough to be near a school but did not go to school, they did better than even those whose grandparents had been to school. So it shows the power of aspiration in social mobility. And then what is also important is the fact that social mobility itself, the fact that you are moving up from your parents affect risk attitude, life outlook. And as a result, might affect even the mobility from the third to the fourth. To conclude, I'm taking this approach to Rise Nigeria. So I'm going to be doing something similar in Nigeria. That's one. And we hope to have a richer data set to do exactly that, because the social networks, which is key here to understand the externalities, the social networks might be different, more hierarchical than what we have here. That's very important. Another thing which is important to stress is the fact that the methodology, I think, is an alternative, perhaps a complementary approach. The usual way we look at social mobility, focus on individuals, focusing on micro data, so that we can document the mechanism of social mobility beyond describing who is up, who is down. Thank you very much.
I think I'll go ahead and get started, and I'm sure my slides will appear soon. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks so much for the organization. I'm excited to present joint work with Richard Akresh, my colleague at the University of Illinois, as well as Daniel Halim, who just graduated from Illinois and is now working at the World Bank. I think for this audience, I can be very brief in terms of motivation. We hope to contribute to a long-standing debate in the light of large government spending and spending by households on education. We hope to contribute to a long-standing debate on the importance of education in the process of economic development. Been stressed by many macroeconomic growth models, but this literatures also stress the challenges of establishing causality. Partly because there may be reverse causality, people may obtain more education in anticipation of increased economic growth, and we see that the estimates differ by the estimation strategies used. In more recent years, there's been major stride forward by the use of randomized controlled trials. But in addition to potential challenges with generalizability, we see that the vast majority of these RCTs are being evaluated very soon after the program ends. And the big question that remains is, do these effects persist over time, or do they fade away, as some recent work, including from folks here in the room, has shown? So we hope to test that quite directly in this paper by asking what are the long-term and even intergenerational effects of increased schooling as a child. And we do so, as Justin already mentioned, we do so by following up on one of the largest school construction programs ever conducted in the 1970s, Indonesia, that was prominently featured by Esther Duflo's 2001 paper, who used this program to estimate the wage returns to education for working-age men. We use a program in a very similar way, but with a different purpose, namely to study the effect, the very long-term effect on a wide range of outcomes, many of which we haven't been able to look at before, at a time that these folks are sort of in their 50s, 40, 50s, 60s. So we've really given the program a lot of time for the effects to manifest themselves. Our Indonesian co-author got access from data, rich data, from 2016. And what's nice, of course, I think very much following up on the previous presentation, by that time, a lot of these folks have had kids as well. So we can also look at how these spillovers to the next generation. Again, a huge debate on the intergenerational transmission of human capital has shown that there's a lot of persistence in economic opportunity that, in fact, is seen as an important reason of increased inequality over time. But I think, as we've just seen, there's very little evidence of this in a developing country context. And also, whether or not there's government programs like this one that can sort of increase intergenerational mobility. We'll look quite a bit at the gender effects as well. And so the marriage market, which end up playing a big role for the intergenerational transmission of human capital, and detailed text data allows us to look at, to do a careful cost-benefit analysis as well. All right, so let me go ahead and zoom into the program right away. Before it started, early 70s, enrollment rates were actually quite low in Indonesia, around 70%. And partly fueled by the oil boom, there was this massive construction, this massive school construction program in just the mid-70s, a couple of years, more than 61,000 schools were built, which was a doubling of the amount of schools. And to give you a bit of a sense of the scale, on average, 2 schools were constructed by per 1,000 school-aged children. There was considerable variation. That's what's shown here geographically. In fact, it was targeted towards the more disadvantaged areas in Indonesia. And as I already mentioned, the flow paper looked at 1995, when these folks are just entering the labor market, and looks at the effects on men. And there's also a couple of other exciting papers, I think, that are quite complementary to the one I'm presenting now. Fast forwarding in time, 2016, large nationally representative data set with questions on lots of labor market variables, migration, expenditure, housing, et cetera, et cetera. I'll be talking about it very soon. And as I already mentioned, what we call the first generation folks, these are now about in their 50s, and the second generation folks are about 15 years old on average. Okay. In terms of estimation strategy, we stick very closely to the paper by Duflo, the 2001 paper, by using a difference in difference where one dimension is given by that geographical dimension I already showed, and the other one is using the fact that some folks were too old to benefit from primary schools, some folks were young enough, so we'll be comparing specifically, let me see, let me just point it out. So we'll be comparing a cohort from 2 to 6 years old. These were young enough to benefit compared to the 12 to 17 year old, and we do so in the low intensity regions and the high intensity regions. So to be very explicit, the identifying assumption then comes down to that difference in these cohorts, these young and old cohorts, is the same in the low intensity areas as well as in the high intensity areas. We'll be using it as a continuous variable, but it extends accordingly. This is what it looks like in equation form, fairly standard diff and diff. In fact, it's exactly what Esther Duflo used at the time, with 2 exceptions. One is that we cluster our standard errors, as you would want to do, and we do so at the district level. And the second thing that we have to think quite carefully about is the fact that we're testing a lot of variables, so we want to adjust for multiple hypothesis testing. We do that in 2 ways. One is by creating indices of outcome, families of outcomes together in an index, and we adjust our standard errors using the false discovery rate. Okay, so I'm going to start with showing a very broad overview of the results. These are these indices of outcomes. This is a little bit more of a positive message, I think, overall. I hope you can see it well enough. Every index represents about half a dozen to a dozen variables. And as you can see, we show them for men and for women. So I'll go through them very briefly, and then we'll get into the specifics when it comes to the actual point estimates, the actual variables. These are standardized values. These are relative to the unexposed individuals. In terms of education, Duflo had shown these for men. We confirmed that there's actually very similar, or these appear seemingly very similar results for women. We actually see some important gender differences very soon when I dive into a little bit more into this. In terms of labor market effects, we actually see that these are a lot larger for men than they are for women. Living standards are our best proxy for earnings, for well-being. There's no earnings data collected, but in an environment where we have a lot of informal work, a lot of agricultural work, expenditure actually gives us a good sense of these living standards. I already mentioned briefly the tax data, which is very detailed, lots of categories, so we'll be using that. Housing assets we see go up. In just the health side, I want to point out that we saw improvements in nutrition. There's a lot of detailed data on exactly the consumption and nutritional intake, especially for women. Health investments improved quite a bit as well, especially preventative health care and family planning. But interestingly, we're not able to detect many improvements, maybe perhaps for men, but not so much in actual health outcomes. Marriage market, I'll talk a little bit more about. We saw these already. We do not see many differences in the program utilization. There's a couple of welfare programs. We don't see much there. And that is all first generation. Then moving here to the right, on the second generation, we see interesting and important improvements on education, as well as on child well-being. That's sort of measured as not having to work, no child labor, as well as improved health. All right, so that's a very broad overview. Now let me dive into the specifics a little bit, starting with education. This is a way that I like showing and sort of teasing out a little bit that one first coefficient that we saw. This is showing the the actual treatment effect in percentage points of completing at least N years of education. So the way to interpret this is that for men right here, the program increased the chances that men would go to school by 0.95 percentage points. Okay, and for women, 2.3 percentage points. I want to point out one thing here that I forgot to say with the empirical strategy. We report all the numbers that you see are reported per 1,000 school-aged children, because you have to standardize these. However, on average, the program built, as you may remember, 2 schools per 1,000 children. So on average, these numbers are actually multiplied by 2 to get the effect on the average intensity of the program. What I think is interesting is that sort of across these primary school ages, we see an increasing trend, especially for women, right? So we see that women increase primary school quite a bit. But then when it comes to lower and upper secondary school, for women it drops down quite a bit, while for men we see that the trends continue. So these are more likely to complete lower and upper secondary school as well. We see no effects on tertiary. These rates are very low at the time. Again, these are folks who were in school in the 70s. Okay. Then a couple of point estimates from a lot of the other variables that we have. You see a lot of bonus slides here that I'm happy to dive into more in the discussion session that we have later. But I wanted to highlight some of the main results that we have here. Top panel is male, bottom panel is female. The likelihood that men work increases by 0.6 percentage point, which is quite sizable, especially given a mean of around 95% already. For women, we do not find such a result as half as small and insignificant. Men tend to move to jobs that are more desirable. They are more likely to be a formal worker and to work in the non-agricultural sector. We do not find these results for women. We do find for both men and women that they migrate more, about 0.7 to 0.8 percentage points. And our best proxy for earnings, for income, is this total expenditure right here. These are inverse hyperbolic signs, so these are percentages. So we have a 2.1% increase for if the man was exposed to the program, 3.2% if women were exposed. Educational expenditure goes up quite a bit as well. Now keep in mind this is 2016 data, so at that point these are expenditure into their kids, right? So this is already sort of highlighting a little bit that we move to that second generation. We see improved tax expenditure. Again, we'll be using those for our cost-benefit analysis. A best proxy for fertility, we see that the number of children reduces for women by quite a bit. And we see here some important differences on the marriage market as well, namely that both men and women marry spouses that are higher educated and more likely to be literate. This is both because everybody's getting more education, but they also move sort of, there's relative and absolute assortative match, and they also move in the marriage distribution, so to say. Okay, that was a lot on first generation. I'm now going to move to the 2G results. Again, I think this follows very naturally on the previous presentation, so I can be very brief. Leonard already motivated that there's been a lot of focus on correlations. We actually don't know so much about the causal effect, so we hope to, again, provide a piece of the puzzle here, especially given that the evidence is so limited for developing countries. So we hope to see, like, what if you actually provide with such a program, can we improve intergenerational mobility? This is the graph, very similar to what you've seen already, the equivalent for the second generation. It's a little bit more messy now because now we have the gender of both the parent as well as of the kid. There's very little action in primary school. That's simply because that's quite universal at this point. Again, we're now in 2016, so a lot of these folks have completed primary school already, but now we see results extending all the way to tertiary education as well. And if you squint your eyes a little bit, the general pattern is that the effects are larger if the mother was the one who was exposed to the program, those are the diamonds, and if the daughter, and on the daughter, those are the red colors that you see. Now, I want to point out that we have a model, a sort of matching model in the paper that explains this a little bit better, that, of course, when we talk about a mother being exposed, things may have changed on the marriage market such that the father then is exposed as well. So, you know, it's a little bit hard to tease it apart. So one of the things that we do for that, again, we have a model to guide us a little bit, but here's a very simple test where we just put both the father's and the mother's exposure on the right-hand side, and we confirm again that it's sort of the mothers that seem to drive these a little bit more. Okay. Another thing that we do is we perform a mediation analysis where we start off in the very beginning right here with the very basic point estimate. So the average effect, if the father was exposed on the kids, is that the kids get about 0.1 of a year extra. And for mothers, it's 0.17. It's hard to read here. And then we say, like, okay, let's throw whatever variables we can at it to sort of see if we can knock this coefficient down. And we do that by, especially because we're interested in the marriage market, putting on the right-hand side a lot of the additional regressors that we know are affected by this program. These are endogenous, of course. There may be unobserved variables as well, but we kind of want to sort of knock down these, this coefficient, and it does quite a bit, especially if we, for example, for the father, control for the fact that his wife, the spouse, had primary education, that reduces his effect quite a bit. So it's sort of indicative that this marriage market is an important mechanism through which these second generation effects manifest themselves. Okay, last thing that we do is a careful cost-benefit analysis, where we can go a step further by just sort of the benevolent dictator, like what are the welfare benefits, price those, etc. We can actually, because of our tax data, we can not just talk about the benevolent dictator, but sort of the selfish dictator, like would they, can the government itself reap the benefits from the program in terms of increased taxes? Just the welfare benefits, we see yes, high internal rate of return, and the payback is about 17 to 30 years. But even if we just look at the taxes, even if we just look at the government getting the money back through increased taxes, we see, yes, there is indeed, this is a good investment, and the program would pay for itself in 25 to 40 years. All right, so we do a lot of robustness checks, which unfortunately I don't have time for, but again, I'm happy to talk either afterwards or in one-on-one conversations today or tomorrow. So let me just go ahead and conclude. It's really just a summary. I already mentioned various first-generation results on education. Men and women on the labor market, more for men than for women. They migrate more, fewer children for women, and we saw the improved living standards for households. On the second generation, we do indeed confirm that there is this intergenerational transmission of human capital, quite large in fact. Especially if the mother is the one who was exposed, and especially if you look at the effect on the daughter. And we saw suggestive evidence that these were driven through these marriage market dynamics. All right, and then as I mentioned, the program increases welfare as well as pays for itself through increased taxes. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm excited to be here to talk about girls' education. As Justin mentioned in his introduction, we still have a lot of girls out of school in the world. A lot of times when I talk to people who work on girls' education, they think about this like, oh, we're mostly focused on secondary school. So in sub-Saharan Africa, a quarter of girls still don't complete primary school. So it's not that the primary school problem is solved. And obviously at secondary school for both girls and boys, the numbers are much, much lower. And so some work that I did with Fei Yuan is what I'm going to talk about what we learn about girls' education from interventions that don't necessarily target or focus on girls. This is supported by Kidney Giving and some support from the World Bank. So again, gaps in access and learning remain. You could argue even as the gaps close, insofar as we believe that education has impacts, which we just saw in Indonesia, that subsequent gender disadvantages could put an argument for continuing to invest in girls' education even more, even once we close the gaps. But we still have a lot of gaps. So, the fundamental question is, how can we most effectively help girls to get an education and get the most out of that education? So we'll start with a thought experiment, which is what kicked off this work for us. So if you imagine a girl-targeted intervention, so it's an intervention that is, just goes to these girls because we want to help make sure that, they make it in school. And, this intervention has a big impact on girls. So we say, it's a success. Well, go us. And maybe the boys are inspired by the girls doing better, and so they do a little better as well. And so, okay, that seems great. And often when we think about girls' education, that's what we look at, is we look at these girl-targeted programs and we say, hey, they worked. Now, again, in this hypothetical thought experiment, so I get to make up all the effect sizes so that it makes it easy for it to work. you have a general intervention, right, that's targeted to both girls and boys, right? There's no specific gender targeting. And it has an even bigger effect on girls. You're like, wow, you know, and then it has a comparable effect on boys. So, you know, a lot of people in the room are researchers, and if you ran this experiment, if you were the person evaluating this, and you were deciding what to title that paper, you probably wouldn't say like how to boost girls' education, because the effects are identical, even though the effect on girls' education is actually much bigger than this other intervention, right? It wouldn't be in the abstract. In fact, you might be tempted, none of us would do this because we're very responsible, but you might be tempted to not even show these results because, you know, you're like, hey, I don't want to show stuff that isn't significant because then people will get on my back about testing for all the multiple hypotheses. So anyway, so the concern that we have is that some of those might be missed. So, okay, so the hypothesis is actually a true thing. That's the big reveal. So here are two interventions. One is a girl-targeted intervention that provide merit scholarships to girls in Kenya towards the end of primary school, and they found a sizable impact on girls' learning. So nearly 0.2 standard deviations, which for a learning intervention is larger than most. Including it had a big impact for girls who had no chance of winning this scholarship. And even boys got kind of excited. It seemed highly unlikely the boys would receive the girls' scholarship, but you know, they worked harder and learned more as well. So that's in Kenya. So an intervention in Bangladesh that was just recently published looked at the impact of setting up parent-teacher conferences. And they found the learning impacts were larger than 0.25 standard deviations for both boys and girls. And as predicted, this study doesn't focus on girls. Girls aren't in the title, they're not in the abstract, but the simple absolute impact on girls' learning is higher. Now, obviously, these are two different contexts taken in two different time periods, but you can see the point that we might miss interventions that are really important for girls if we don't look at all interventions. So in this work, we posed three questions. First, are the interventions that are targeted to girls, are they actually the most effective for helping girls get and succeed in school, get to school and succeed in school? And then, so we might, even if the girl-targeted interventions aren't the most effective, we might worry that general interventions, even if they're better for girls than girl-targeted interventions, we might worry about them if they are inequality increasing, right? If they enhance inequality. So for example, so we ask whether impacts on girls tend to be larger for general interventions, right? Are they inequality enhancing or inequality decreasing? And then the last question is, what are the most effective, just in simple terms, what do we find as the most effective interventions for girls? Okay, so there are a lot of collections of evidence on how to improve education for girls. There are a lot of insights that come out of those. All of those tend to focus on girl-targeted interventions. And so a couple of examples, the Adolescent Girls Program Review, we searched 4 electronic database for programs that development programs targeting adolescent girls. Again, not an unreasonable approach, but we missed something there. The Girls' Education and Gender Equality Review, the search strategy. What do we look for? Studies about girls in Africa in school, gender in Africa. Again, what we're going to see are studies that fundamentally, interventions that target girls. So when we talk about girl-targeted interventions, what we mean are interventions where the benefits are principally targeted towards girls, or the intervention is designed specifically around girls. So cash and in-kind transfers that are targeted exclusively to girls, like the Malawi intervention that many of you are familiar with, some work in Pakistan and Burkina Faso, scholarships, tuition elimination and subsidies, school supplies specifically for girls, WASH programs that are, again, focused on girls' needs, for example, making sure that you have gender-specific latrines, school construction when it is designed specifically around boosting girls' enrollment, that's the stated focus of the program, and then training programs for girls and school-age girls empowerment programs. Okay, so in short, what we did was we looked at a whole bunch of studies that had either learning or access outcomes in education. We found all the studies that already differentiated gender impacts. And then we also looked at, for all the studies that didn't, we reached out to the authors to say, hey, can you run one more regression for us? Or can you send us the data and we'll run one more regression? So this is the way that shook out. We found about 330 studies overall that had learning or access outcomes. So 2 out of 3 studies, 205 of those studies did not report gender differentiated impacts. So if you do an intervention that looks at individual student impacts, I am 99% sure that you gathered data on the gender of the students. I have yet to see a study that does individual level impacts, doesn't gather it. It's possible, there's that 1%, I'm sure that exists, but they almost all have this data somewhere in their data set, but they're not reporting it. So we found about 108 general interventions, so non-gender targeted, that had gender differentiated impacts reported, 20 with girl targeted interventions. So with these ones that didn't report them, we said, all right, let's try to find it. And as many of you are authors, as you know, there's nothing you like more than 7 years after you publish the paper, getting an email from someone saying, hey, can you run this regression for me? You're like, that was 6 laptops ago. So amazingly, and thank you, there are many authors in this room who did additional analysis for us. For 43 studies, we actually got new estimates from authors. For 9 studies, the authors either gave us the data or said, hey, the data's on my website, didn't you? Why didn't you check there first? So, so we were able to get 50 additional studies. We extracted the point estimates and standardized, and we ultimately ended up with 180 studies with 274 total interventions. A lot of studies, of course, test 2 or 3 interventions within the context of one study. So the first takeaway here, before we even get to the results, right, is that we can't learn what works best for girls if we don't measure it. And so if we don't report gender differentiated impacts, we can never learn what the most effective interventions are for girls. Now, some studies aren't powered to, don't have the statistical power to demonstrate a statistically significant difference between the impact on boys and the impact on girls. And so as a researcher, sometimes we think, oh, well, that's less interesting. Often in those cases, we can still identify what the impact on girls is, period, right? We may not be able to distinguish between the impact on boys, but if we care about girls' education, then knowing that impact is very useful. So report gender differentiated impacts. You know, if you need to report it in an appendix, you can report it in the appendix as exploratory research. Maybe it wasn't in your pre-analysis plan, but there's no reason not to explore this, not to report this. Okay, so just to be clear, a few things that we're not studying here. So we're focusing on access and learning outcomes because we propose that one of the things that school does that's important is like have the kids there in school and help them learn. So there are a lot of other things that schools do. We tend to have very few studies that actually examine, you know, in careful ways what the impacts. The answer, it's not that there are 0 of those studies, but very few. So synthesizing them can be a challenge. So we don't find studies that look at kind of life skills interventions and their impact on learning and access, norm changing interventions that seek to change norms in schools, and then obviously, we don't include unevaluated interventions. So sometimes when I talk to people about this research, they're like, hey, we're doing this amazing program, you know, somewhere. And I say, that sounds amazing. Why don't you evaluate it and send me the results? Because, you know, so insofar as, you know, one of the implications of this is we have far less coverage of secondary school interventions simply because people have evaluated far fewer secondary school interventions. Okay, so, you know, these studies, you can see the distribution. We have a lot of studies in East Asia and the Pacific, quite a few studies in Latin America and the Caribbean, and a number of studies spread around sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so the answer, are girl-targeted interventions the most effective for girls? So what we show here is the distribution of impacts. If you line up the standardized impacts across all these interventions, right, for the general non-targeted interventions and then for the girl-targeted interventions, what we find is that for access, girl-targeted interventions are similar on average, maybe with slightly larger variation. That's not statistically significant. So for example, if you look at the median intervention between these two, it's 0.07. This is the impact on girls specifically for general interventions. It's 0.04 for the girl-targeted interventions. There's no clear difference between those. You know, we have, there's one girl-targeted school construction program up here at the end that did well, but even these are small differences. So it's certainly not the case that these girl-targeted interventions are having, you know, that these are the answer to solving our girls' education problems. When, you know, whereas the general interventions are not achieving those. In fact, we see that general interventions do a lot, and you know, on average, they do just about as much for girls as the girl-targeted interventions. So in terms of learning, we see a very similar pattern. So the impact is very similar. We don't see any advantage to girl-targeted interventions. Again, the median effect is almost identical, even in point estimate, even at the 90th percentile. So the best interventions and even the worst interventions are pretty similar. So if you want to find a program to not help girls, you can choose between girl-targeted and general interventions. We do not endorse that approach. So none of these differences are statistically significant. And then we also, for learning, one of the challenges with comparing learning results is people test different things. So if you're testing kids on whether they can recognize a letter, it's easier to help them improve with that than testing whether they can actually read and comprehend. If we restrict the analysis to interventions with similar types of tests, we find very similar results. Okay. So message number 2, general interventions can be just as effective for girls as girl-targeted interventions, and they include boys, which in a lot of places politically is a much easier sell, right? Policymakers cater to voters, and voters have boys about as often as they have girls. And so interventions that can help girls a lot that also benefit boys can be valuable. Another useful point here is that there are more tested successful interventions amongst the general interventions. So if we use as just one cutoff 0.2 standard deviations as larger than that being an effective intervention, we have 32 tested effective interventions amongst the general interventions and just 9 amongst the girl-targeted interventions. So the point of that being is that we have a big menu to draw on. It doesn't mean that we should throw away these effective girl-targeted interventions. What it does mean is that we have a big menu that we can draw on, and we should use the whole menu to help girls, use the best interventions in each category. Okay, so do impacts on girls tend to be greater for general interventions? What we find for access, so this is ignoring the girl-targeted interventions, just looking at the impact on girls and on boys of these general interventions. Again, what we see is that the impacts of general interventions tend to be very similar. Like, if anything, if you were going to guess anything from this distribution, you can see the distribution is slightly to the larger side on the impacts of girls. So essentially, these results are very similar and, if anything, slightly larger for girls. And this is consistent with some work that the Poverty Action Lab did, specifically looking at access amongst randomized controlled trials that found bigger effects for girls on average. For learning, again, very similar. The impacts of general interventions are very similar for girls and boys, and so general interventions are not inequality enhancing, right? They don't make inequality worse. They may not be solving if that's your principal concern. So again, none of these are statistically significant difference, which it doesn't take a degree in econometrics to see. These are just very similar numbers. So general interventions help girls at least as much as boys. So the last question that we ask are, what are the most effective interventions for girls, period? Now, one way to do this is a formal meta-analysis. One of the challenges with formal meta-analysis, there are a lot of benefits to it. One of the challenges with it is that you end up mashing together a lot of very disparate interventions that all kind of fall under some similar category. So what we did was we started with a simple approach, which is, okay, what are the top interventions? What are the most effective interventions for expanding access to girls' education? So just 3 of these, the ones in red, are girl-targeted interventions. So what we see here is we see a lot of interventions that reduce the cost of schooling. And then we also, it's notable that a lot of these access interventions operate through the household rather than through the school. Now, we also looked at the bottom 10, because you're like, well, hey, maybe the top 10 is just populated by stuff that's been studied a lot. And so you see you just see the same stuff in the bottom 10. So we do see some cost reducers, but there are fewer of them here. There are far more. So it's not that cost reduction is, some magic bullet, but it figures much more prominently in the top of the distribution than in the bottom. So if we want to improve girls' access to school, cut the cost. In terms of improving learning, what we see here, the top interventions, there are a lot of pedagogical interventions here at the top. Ben Piper, why don't you raise your hand? He evaluated all these, so if you want to help girls learn, just call Ben. You have a couple of computer-assisted learning programs in the top, but if you look at the bottom, you also have some of these ICT-related interventions there, so there's a real mixed bag in that regard. But it does seem like amongst these top interventions, improving pedagogy for all students is an excellent way to go to improve learning for girls. Okay, so just to be the final point, what we're not saying here, we're not saying like, oh, ignore gender, all these problems will be solved if you just, do these general interventions. We can be intentional about gender, but we can use all the tools, the most effective programs to help girls. And then also, we are limited by what's been evaluated. And so if there are novel, interesting things that haven't been evaluated, then we need to evaluate those and see what what novel ways there are to help girls succeed in school. Thank you very much. I'm just going to grab my...
That was an action-packed session. Lots to digest there. I don't know if you can hear me. Yes? Excellent. Let's go ahead and take questions for the group or for individuals. I'm going to not hog the mic here and just turn it over to you, and we're going to take a round here. So challenge to the presenters here to try to remember these questions as we gather the group. All right, so Jacobus, let's start there. Sorry, Mike.
Hi, Jacobus here from Georgetown University. Just a personal worry I always have on social mobility in education, more for the second and third speakers, is that I feel like if you think about general equilibrium effects and the fact that education might just be a signaling device, then it only works as a source of social mobility if very few other people also get an education. And you can see that with the returns to education as well. It's at that period where very few other people are getting tertiary education where the returns are much higher. So will education be ineffective once everybody becomes educated?
Okay, all the way over here on my left.
Hi, I'm Aditi. I'm a master's student at Princeton. I had a question for David Evans on the gender-targeted and general intervention space. Two things. I was wondering, do we see very prominent effects for girls in the general interventions, possibly because it's low-hanging fruit, possibly maybe a levels thing because girls are so much worse off than boys at baseline? And secondly, do you think it's useful restricting the analysis to, say, a pool of interventions that are only scholarships or only cash transfers and kind of comparing conditional cash transfers that are general to conditional cash transfers that are targeted, or say scholarships that are general to scholarships that are targeted, just to kind of get consistency and comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges?
Okay, and then there was a hand here. Actually, whoever's passed the mic the other way.
Hi, is this working?
Not sure. Try again.
Is this working? Yes. My question is also for Dave Evans. So I'm curious that within learning, did you look at math and reading, writing separately? Because those look very different for girls.
Okay, why don't we try one here in the middle?
Hi, thanks for great presentations. I'm Joe DeStefano from RTI. I have a question for Abhijeet on the study looking at the impacts of test scores on SES differences in adulthood, and if you were able to look at other factors that may constrain lower income students' access to advanced years of schooling besides their test scores.
Okay, excellent. Why don't we start with those, and then we'll have time, I think, if we move quickly for another round. So I think maybe that was both for Leonard and Marieke on, is intergenerational mobility going to disappear in general equilibrium once everybody's going to school?
I'm not sure, because in fact, when you look at second to third, and it's clear that it's like 150 years later. So the level of mobility that you observe captures what's happening at country level, regional level. There are, quality of schools and supply, demand sides, all combined. Maybe in future works, for instance, we are not good just to capture the original impetus for mobility, but see, for instance, what is the supply side response, to those initial impulses, and then to, but this is all embedded in what's happening from the second to the third. Let's not forget that, the school that I picked were a sample of schools that were set up from 1895 to 1922. So it is a representative sample of schools in the country. But again, the point here, general equilibrium or partial equilibrium, the point here is the powerful effect of aspiration, of social networks in explaining the spread of education, not only intergenerationally, but also spatially. So policy that kind of build on this insight to enable intergenerational kind of connection, to get kids excited, parents excited, and exploiting this, this drive for mobility, which is, aspirations. And so I think it's something which is very, very powerful. That's the main message. Obviously, more need to be done to incorporate the supply side.
I'm tempted to say, Marieke, that your effects might be incorporating net of these general equilibrium effects. Is that how you'd see it?
Yeah, of course. Oh, right, we don't need that, that's right. So thanks, Jess. I actually want to make one additional point, thanks so much for your question, which is a bit more of an econometric point, which is that, and I'm sure lots of folks here in this room have dealt with this, is that if you estimate the effect of any such program, and you have some kind of treatment and some kind of control, like is it the treatment being better off, or is it through general equilibrium effect, the control being a little worse off, right? And you want to be very careful with almost any empirical strategy, even RCTs, right? Like you want to be very careful like what you're picking up on. So there's some exciting work. Kartik Munarinaran, who will be presenting tomorrow, I think has done some proper studies where you really set up to look at the GE effects. Gaurav Khanna has an interesting paper for India. The kinds of things that we do, because we've of course thought a ton about these issues. There are some, actually Esther Duflo again had a 2004 paper where she looks at some of these GE effects, so we can do some bounding there. We do a very simple placebo test where we say, remember that we had to differentiate the young and the old, where we say, let's compare old and even older. Where we shouldn't find any result, right? Because they're both unexposed, but you can sort of, if to the extent that they're not equally substitutable with, because it all depends on the substitution in the labor market, right? Like it could be that they're substituted in the labor market, it could be that they're complements, and that would sort of determine whether there's positive or negative spillover. So those are the kind of things that you can do, but in general, I just wanted to sort of extend it to that econometric point as well, which I think is challenging.
Dave, you want to come in on? There were a couple of questions there for you.
Yeah, so on Aditi's point about whether kind of the girls are the low-hanging fruit in some sense, because basically lower initial levels, maybe it's easier to have bigger impacts. One of the interesting things that we found in some initial analysis on this is that we don't see any correlation in the size of the impact and the initial kind of country level kind of girls' access. So it's not that in countries with really low levels of girls' access, that's where all the top 10, like all the effective interventions for increasing access just happen to be from countries that are from, the countries with lowest levels of access. We don't actually see a relationship there at all. And so it seems like that's not what's driving these results, but it's an important association to keep in mind. On this other point about reading versus math, which kind of speaks to this, in a number of contexts, on average, if you just look at the kind of average performance, often, girls tend to do a bit better in reading and worse in math. This varies hugely from context to context, but it's come out in a number of places. So we haven't broken those up. I think that's an interesting question, and that's something we can do for kind of the next round of analysis.
And finally, Abhijeet, if learning gains aren't going to solve poor kids' problems, what is?
I was meant to be the doom and gloom speaker this morning, and I'll stick with that. So what we were trying in the paper was just to put some basic descriptives and just contrast this with a lot of the message that's come out of some of the older US literature that credit constraints and things that occur essentially at the time that people are making the transition from secondary school onwards matter a lot less than stuff that happened by the end of primary school. And that, I think, we're finding less information, less support for in the data. We do know a little bit about stuff that does change enrollment at those margins. I mean, from reducing schooling costs to things like Rebecca Dijon-Ross has some work on information constraints, Rob Jensen has work on information constraints. A bunch of those seem to bind more for poorer households. So whether those constraints are directly financial in terms of credit, liquidity, and so on, whether they are in terms of social networks, do you know how to get into college and what kind of college is worth getting into and why? It could be a whole bundle of those. So that's, to be honest, I mean, that's also not something we can convincingly do with the data we have. We just want to say that, you know, test scores don't serve as quite the summary statistic that they've been presumed to serve in various other contexts.
Okay, I think we have time for one more lightning round of questions. Let's start with Claire at the front.
So I want to try and recover some optimism in Abhijeet's paper. So you started off by saying, well, you presented a table early on the returns to schooling across a bunch of regions and said that it was all tertiary. But then when you moved on to look at your 5 countries, you didn't actually give us labour market outcomes, you gave us years of schooling. Okay, admittedly, that was a step forward. Is there any hope that you might get that data on labour market outcomes? And is it just possible that adding 1.5 years of schooling in some of your countries is enough, and the 3-year gap is not really where it's at? You know, so I maybe I'm pessimistic, but I also want to think there's a chance of recovering some optimism.
Before you answer that, toward the back there in the blue shirt.
Hi, this was a point for David. One thing I found a little bit sobering about the sort of initial part of your presentation was that how few studies actually, for which you had access to the data in a good enough form to be able to do the analysis yourself. And I think that a point that you didn't make that I would make is publish your data and publish all of it so that anybody who comes in and wants to do these types of heterogeneity analysis, if we neglect to put it in our paper or in our appendices or any other kind of heterogeneity that somebody might be interested in across a large set of studies, to actually make the data publicly available and in a way that researchers can come in and do extra analyses that we might not have actually done.
Hear, hear. All right, Nick there.
Thanks. Nick Spoor from Stellenbosch in South Africa. The question's for Dave. You mentioned in passing this comment that policymakers like to introduce policies that don't exclude half their population, that if it benefits boys, it's great as well. Do you have any examples of where that type of rationale and logic means that policymakers are more likely to take those studies seriously than girl-targeted interventions? So kind of moving it from an anecdote, do we have examples of policies like that in developing countries? Thanks.
One more. Front row, yes. All the way down front.
Thanks. Rafa de Hoyos from the World Bank. I don't think I agree with your conclusion, your pessimistic conclusion about the paper. I actually think that explaining half of the variation in years of schooling is a lot, given measurement error of this standardized test, given the fact that you're just measuring possibly math and reading comprehension. So for me, is the opposite. Is quite it's a variable that is explaining quite a lot of the variation. And in some of these cases, if I understood correctly, you're measuring these at 6th grade. In some of these countries, so you measure learning outcomes at 6th grade, and that is enough to explain quite a bit of your variation. Even 6 years after when you're finishing compulsory schooling. So the fact that it's that is explaining all that is, for me, is a very optimistic result.
All right.
That's helpful.
Okay, so why don't we wrap up there? Abhijeet, do you want to come in on Claire's point about labor market returns and Rafa's point about the glass being half full.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I didn't want to overclaim, and maybe I was more pessimistic than I should have been. What we're trying to get at is just like, we don't have these descriptors, we should, and then we can have a discussion about, well, are these big, are these small, what would we reasonably have? These are smaller than the literature we have taken as the benchmark so far. Okay, so that's all I want you to take there. I wish we could do labor market returns. These kids are about, well, these once kids are about 23 years old now, which means that the ones who went to higher education aren't yet in the stable jobs where you can. So we would need to wait a bit and then hope somebody drops a ton of money that allows Jishnu to go back to those individuals in Pakistan, that allows Young Lives to go back in those 4 countries. The surveys are over, right? I mean, these projects are over. Realistically, I mean, I don't think we will have a better shot of ever getting at exactly that question for another decade otherwise. So yeah, I mean, that's in case anybody with checkbooks is in the room.
Dave, there were a couple questions for you.
Yeah.
One was more of a speech, which I want to endorse, and the other was, do policymakers really care?
Yeah, so on this point about people publishing the data, so again, just to put the numbers on that, right? So out of 200 studies that did not report gender differentiated impacts, we were actually able to find the data, and in a few of those cases it was posted, in other cases someone sent us the data in 9. Now, I'm not an expert at numeracy, but that's like 5%. So a lot of people are not posting their data, certainly not in a way that we could kind of do this work. And so that's something, it's essential. As a researcher myself, I know a lot of times this isn't born out of like any sort of, you're trying to hide something. It's a bit of work to get your data set into shape, and it's clean, and you put it in a place where you feel comfortable. But if we care about the science here, then that's just something that we have to allocate time for. And on this last point, on Nick's idea of going from vague anecdotal evidence to specific anecdotal evidence, in some sense. So a lot of this has come out of conversations with operational staff at the World Bank, for example, that have highlighted, so I can't point to like a specific policy, like they did this policy rather than this policy because it was general. But in conversations with people who work on Senegal, conversations with people who work on Mozambique, who've highlighted that the government just has very little taste for interventions that are gender targeted because of the political challenges, when in a lot of these environments, boys, it's not like boys are receiving some world-class education, right? Like boys are also receiving like a low-quality education and not enough of it. And so programs that devote a lot of resources just to girls' education can sometimes be a hard sell. That's Soberwall 2019 is the citation for that.
Excellent. All right, we should wrap up here, but I want to give the last chance to Marieke and Leonard. Any final comments on the session?
I enjoyed it. Nothing else. No, unless there's any questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a great opportunity to talk about something that I think it's overlooked, which is how system change and deep-rooted differences across countries and regions are driven by historical events. And then sometimes we document them to look at long-term effect, but we don't focus enough on mechanism, especially behavioral mechanism. Education, change behavior, attitudes, get people to be optimistic, driven. And I think it matters as much as, jobs and other things. Yeah, anyway, thanks.
Great. So in final wrap-up, I was tasked to summarize this session. I think there's too much diversity here to give a pithy, simple summary. But we started off with the question of whether education was the great equalizer. I think we have effect sizes pointing in the right direction, even when we didn't get all the way there in Abhijeet's case. But we learned, I think, new and really interesting things about this question of intergenerational transmission. If you came in, I think, with the premise that we know how to get kids in school, and we've done that, but we don't know how to teach them to learn anything, we kind of turned that on its head a little bit. We have some effective interventions at getting kids learning. We're still struggling and see high returns from getting them through more and more years of education. But both of these, all of these studies pointed towards effective ways of using education as a tool to address gender inequality, wealth gaps, and lack of intergenerational mobility. So thanks to all the speakers. We're going to go to a coffee break now. We are back in half an hour. You've had a healthy coffee break.
Thank you.
We could have talked for another 20 minutes.